Welcome to Windows Presentation Foundation, Building Custom Controls in WPF. My goal with this screencast is to briefly introduce the types of custom controls you can build in WPF. That being said, one of the first questions you should ask yourself is, do I really need a custom control? WPF offers several technologies that allow far more customization to existing controls than before, and you will save yourself a lot of time and effort if you can reuse an existing control rather than write your own. For basic customizations, styles will usually suffice, and with control templates, you can completely replace the look and feel of a control. So when do you need custom controls? Well, there's several scenarios, but let's talk about the two most common. If you want to build a reusable component that is essentially multiple controls put together, a custom control may be the right way to go. For instance, if I wanted to do a lot of data entry in which users were going to be putting in addresses, I wouldn't want to copy and paste the XAML for an address control repeatedly. It'd be better to wrap that XAML into a single user control and then be able to reuse it. Also, if you need a control whose functionality is simply not provided by existing WPF controls, then again, a custom control might be the best solution. For instance, a rating control is something that doesn't exist in the WPF library out of the box. So that may be something, because the functionality is simply not there, and it's not a control that's a version of something that is there, it might be a good option if you needed such a control for your solution. Now, the Wpf Class Library provides several control classes that you can derive your control from, but the two most commonly used are user control and control. Choose user control if you want to build your control like you build an application by combining existing components. Controls that are derived from user control are not going to support complex customizations though. You should choose to inherit from control if you want your control to be highly reusable. Usually, you'll need to choose control if you want your control to support control templates and therefore be easily customizable by users, or you want your control to support themes. Now, let's see a brief demo in which we create a control of each type. And by the way, I wouldn't call these complete controls by any means. Their purpose is to simply introduce the basic concepts and get you started in the right direction. We'll start with a new project in Visual Studio. I'll select File, New Project, and then select Windows and WPF Application. We'll just take the default name. And as soon as the solution is built, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add the two different types of controls. And I'll do them at the same time just so you can get a quick sense of what each of them look like. So first I'm going to right-click the solution in Solution Explorer and select Add New Item. And from the list, I'll add a user control. Now we want to make sure that we add the right kind of user control and not a Windows Forms user control, which is what we would get if we selected the plain user control. No, we need user control WPF. Another way to make sure that we get the right one is to select WPF from the category, and then the only option will be the right kind of user control. We'll go ahead and call this address control. And you can see that it's going to create a file with a XAML extension. And if we click Add, we'll get a address control.xaml along with a code behind file of the same name with my chosen language, which happens to be C#. You'll see that it's nearly identical to the page that or the window that we're editing. Let's see if I make some room for myself. You can see that the user control has a grid, a height and width of 300, the appropriate namespace declarations. It's a user control, and that is the only difference between that and our primary window that we started with. Everything else is identical other than the window tag. So you can see that building a user control is very similar to building an application. We're going to go ahead, edit the XAML file, edit the code behind file, etc. What does it look like to create a control that's derived from simply control? Well, again, I'll right-click WPF Application. I'm going to go ahead and add New Item. And it's going to remember that I filtered for WPF, and so now it's very easy to find simply Custom Control. So we'll leave the default and click Add. And notice that here, I don't get a XAML file, or at least I don't appear to initially get a XAML file. In fact, I have just customcontrol.cs, with some boilerplate code and some comments, some suggestions as to some first steps. What it also defined, though, or added to my project is a themes directory under which we have generic.xaml, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. At any rate, let's go ahead and implement our address control. So the address control, again, we build like we would build any application. So for instance, if I wanted to add some grid columns and rows, I would add that. I might add some existing controls like some text blocks and maybe some text boxes as well. So the manner in which I'm going to create an address control is simply by reusing existing WPF controls, and we can nest these. So for instance, if I wanted to create another user control that was made up of 2 address controls, that could be easily done as well too. I'm going to remove the height so that we don't have that extra space, and now I've got a simple address control that I could reuse. And of course I could add code behind to this file for validation maybe, and to provide other functionality that could be nice with a reusable control. So my address control is done, and that's a simple example of a user control. But what about something that's derived from control? Well, certainly a fully custom control that really exhibits what controls are supposed to look like and supposed to do. You can't really build it in 2 or 3 minutes, but I will point out that we have the custom control, again, this boilerplate code. Right, this is what is essentially the code behind, because this is my C# or it would be the VB file. And here is where you can see that it inherits from control as opposed to address control, which inherits from user control. But back to the custom control, there's very little else in the code behind file. That's ultimately where I'd want the functionality and the implementation code. But there's going to be some manner of user interface code. And the thing about designing controls in WPF is that if they're done quote unquote correctly, they should be lookless. And certainly that's the case for all of the out-of-the-box controls. And for more on that, you should see the video on control templates, because control templates sort of take advantage of the fact that WPF controls are lookless. They don't require a specific look and feel, or maybe another way to think of it is the look and feel can be completely overridden by using a control template. At any rate, the fact that we can completely replace the look and feel doesn't mean that we don't need to supply a default look and feel. And the default look and feel in this case is actually in generic.xaml. So generic.xaml was added when we added the custom control. And you'll see here that in generic.xaml we have a resource dictionary, and in here this is where we're actually referencing, and this is what ties this particular XAML code to the custom control that was added. So this code was added for us, and again, creating a sort of legitimate custom control is something that will take a little while, but just for purposes of example, let's go ahead and add a text block. And the text block might have some text in it. You know, this is my custom control. And I can also do template binding, just like it's shown here, like the border features template binding. We can do the same thing. And so for instance, we can add template binding for foreground to the text. So that's my very, very, very simple custom control. At this point, I should be able to build and hope everything succeeds. And now what if I want to test it? Well, I've made things pretty easy on myself because I'm putting everything in the same project. Normally you wouldn't do that, because if you want reusability and you were designing controls, you'd put them in a controls library. But for our purposes, everything in the same place. I do need the right namespace reference though. So if I wander over to window1.xaml, I'm going to go ahead and make some changes to the UI here. In order to be able to reference the custom controls that are in this namespace, I'm going to add a namespace declaration, and I can call it really whatever I want. I'll simply call it custom, and then from the drop-down list, I'll select WPF application 1 in assembly WPF application 1. That is simply the namespace and the assembly name that was chosen when we started the demo. Now I've got two controls, so I'll create two rows. One for each. And now I can define or add these custom controls. So first, in the top, I'll add an address control. Let's make the foreground white and the background, let's say, dark green. And we can also add our custom control 1. And in fact, custom control is where I want the foreground and background. And I also want that to be in grid row 1. And now we have a user control and a custom control created in the space of a few minutes. And hopefully this gives you at least an idea of when to choose which type of control and gets you started down the right road. Thanks very much.